I still remember the day I opened that old wooden chest and found a letter my mother had hidden for decades. With every line I read, the image of my perfect family shattered, and I realized the life I thought I knew was built on silence and sacrifice. The truth inside those yellowed pages was heavier than any burden I had ever carried. But before we begin, I have a small request. Please like this video and subscribe to the channel, because it helps me so much to continue sharing my stories. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I'd be so glad to know how far my voice can travel. I've never been there. The sea air of New England has a way of clinging to memory. Even now, at 78, I can close my eyes and feel the cool Atlantic mist slide over the cedar shingles. Hear the gulls carve pale arcs in a sky the color of pewter, and smell the faint tang of salt that never quite leaves your clothes. Our town hugged the coast like an old keepsake box, paint chipped, hinges squeaking but cherished, its narrow streets stitched together by stone walls and wind-bent elms. In summer, the harbor chimed with halyards and laughter. In winter, the tide spoke low and serious, and every doorstep learned to keep its own company. I grew up in a small clapboard house a few blocks from the water, where the floors creaked in a friendly way, and the windows, when the wind leaned in, hummed like a choir holding a single note. People said our home felt steady, respectable, as if the house itself believed in good manners. We kept the lawn trimmed and the porch swept. My mother pressed our curtains until they hung like quiet thoughts. It was the 1960s, and from the outside we looked like a family that had found the right distance from the world, polite, decent, orderly. My father was James Collins, a man who thought routine was a kind of prayer. He dressed as though every day might ask for his best. Crisp shirt, sleeves smooth, collar just so. His hair dark, parted sharp, already silvering at the temples earlier than he liked to admit. He wasn't cruel, he was careful. Careful with his words, careful with his temper, careful with the way the world might measure a man and his household. When he sat at the table, back straight and shoulders squared, even the chairs seemed to mind themselves. My mother was Helen, a gentle woman with quiet hands. She moved through a room like a good song, nothing loud, nothing wasted, everything in tune. Her dresses were simple, tailored enough to say she took pride in things, but not so fine she couldn't kneel to scrub a stain from the kitchen floor. She wore her hair pinned in a soft twist, a few blonde wisps always escaping near her temples, as if some part of her insisted on remembering the wind. When she smiled, it was half a secret and half a shelter. Neighbors saw what they wanted to see, a house where the front steps were painted and the mailbox stayed straight, a husband with a firm handshake, and a wife who brought a pie to the church bazaar. Good people, they'd say, because it felt good to say it. In that time and place, the right pleasantries could pass for the whole truth. But the truth, in our house, had an odd way of keeping to corners. If you looked straight at it, you would miss it. If you listened for it, you'd hear only the tick of the kitchen clock. It lived in the spaces between sentences, in the way a room could be full and still feel empty. It lived, especially, at Sunday supper. We were faithful to that table the way some are faithful to hymns. The percolator purred on the stove. The oven breathed out the shy sweetness of an apple pie cooling on the counter, its cinnamon tracing quiet spirals into the air. There would be roast chicken, a dish of green beans shining with butter, mashed potatoes scooped like little white hills, a basket of cornbread tucked in a folded towel to keep the warmth from wandering off. My mother set the napkins with patient hands. My father aligned his knife and fork as if the angles mattered. For the first few minutes, there were always words. How was the weather by the harbor? My father's voice even, as if he were calling a ball game no one could afford to lose. Did you straighten your room? My mother gentle but thorough. We spoke of the tide, the wind, whether the Collins place needed a fresh coat of paint come spring. The small things earned their parade down the length of the table. Then, as steady as the tide turning, came the quiet. It didn't slam the door. It simply arrived, stretched its legs, and made itself at home. Silverware chimed against china, small bright sounds swallowed by something larger. I learned the choreography without being taught. My father set his shoulders, my mother folded her hands, and I folded my questions. The kitchen clock counted us down like a referee who pitied both teams. I was a child, but children know what rooms feel like. I knew a happy room. It looked you in the eye. Ours looked down. My father's jaw would harden, just a notch you might miss if you weren't watching him the way a daughter watches a door. My mother's eyes, blue-gray, kind as a blanket, would soften and slide away, as if some thought had tapped her on the shoulder and asked to be hidden. Sometimes I tried to earn the sound of voices back. I'd tell them what the lady at the candy counter had said about new peppermints, or how the sky had been so clear at dusk the moon looked like a pearl a giant might pluck from the sea. My mother listened with her smile. My father listened with his posture. The stories fluttered a moment and then settled, like napkins after a breeze. The house had its own music on those nights, a faucet's steady drip, the hum of the icebox, the soft complaint of the back screen when the wind pressed it and let it go. Even the apple pie seemed to hold its breath, the shiny crust cooling into silence. After coffee, my mother gathered the plates with careful hands. She did not clatter. She stacked the dishes as if noise were a kind of rudeness we could not afford. I remember the light most of all, how it pooled beneath the shade over the table, keeping to its circle, how the edges of the room fell into a quiet shadow where corners met and secrets might curl up to sleep. Sometimes the shadow felt kind. Sometimes it felt like a map my parents could read but wouldn't share. My father would ask me to pass the salt and say, "Thank you, Margaret," in that tidy voice he kept for company and Sunday. My mother would smooth the tablecloth with the flat of her palm, as though wrinkles, like worries, could be trained to lie down. In those small motions, salt passed, linen smoothed, I heard a language that wasn't mine yet, a grammar of carefulness. I did not have the words then. Uneasy was the closest I could come, and even that felt like a grown-up's coat slipping off my shoulders. I knew only that something in the room had a weight to it, like a storm that had decided to sit in one place and watch our house through the window. And I knew that whenever the storm looked too long, my parents looked away. Outside, the town went on being itself, boats rocking in their slips, porch lights winking on at dusk, the diner's neon sign buzzing like a friendly hornet. The world was simple and practical beyond our windows. In our kitchen, the practical things, plates, forks, cups, did their duties with schoolteacher patience, while the air did its work of being thick. On weekdays, life walked along at a respectable pace. Chores were done, beds made, shoes polished until they caught light and returned it politely. My mother kept a small tin of buttons and saved lengths of ribbon, not because we needed them today, but because tomorrow was always waiting. My father read the paper in the evenings, spectacles balanced on the bridge of his nose, turning each page with a care that made it sound like he was reasoning with the news rather than accepting it. And yet, while the town trusted us to be a family with no stories that bent out of shape, I learned to read shadows. A daughter notices where her mother sets a letter and when. A daughter notices when her father's good night sounds exactly like a good day, as if both are ways to end a conversation. I noticed, and I tried not to. There is a kindness in not asking. That's what I believed then, that questions were stones you didn't toss into water if you meant to keep it clear. So I held them, small, round, cold, turning them in my pocket until they warmed to the skin. I told myself I was being good. I told myself good daughters don't make trouble. But sometimes, lying awake with the wind combing the trees, I felt the questions turn back into stones. Sundays returned like clockwork, decent and familiar. Apple pie cooled, cornbread loosened from the pan, coffee perked itself into conversation. We sat, we passed plates, we folded napkins, we spoke of the weather and paint and anything that would not spill. And then, like always, the quiet came, stepping through the doorway as if it had been invited. I did not understand the source, only the shape. It was the shape of my father's eyes dropping to his plate. It was the shape of my mother's smile, kind and a little worn, thinning at the edges when a thought tugged at it from the inside. It was the shape of two people who had decided, for reasons I could not yet name, that looking at each other too long might say more than their mouths were ready to allow. Once, as the coffee steamed and the pie's sweetness hung like a soft ribbon in the room, I looked from one parent to the other, wishing, sudden and fierce, that the silence would crack like ice and show what lay beneath. My father lifted his cup. My mother steadied the saucer with 2 fingers. Their eyes met just for a breath, then slipped away. And in that gentle, practiced motion, eyes finding eyes and then fleeing, I felt it again, strong as the tide that pulls at every boat in our harbor. There was something unspoken living with us, something deeper than politeness, older than a habit. I could not yet name it. I could only watch it pass between my parents like a shadow that knew its way around our table. Their eyes slid away, and the room, tidy as ever, kept our secret for another Sunday. Death rarely knocks politely. It comes as a storm, tearing the sky open without warning, leaving behind silence too heavy for any room to bear. I was 25 when it happened, an age when life still feels like it owes you clarity, when you believe that tomorrow will behave itself. My father, James Collins, had left for work on an ordinary Tuesday, his tie straight, his briefcase in hand, his voice steady as he told my mother he'd be home in time for supper. By evening, he was gone. The call came from the county hospital. I remember my mother answering the phone in the kitchen, her apron still dusted with flour from a pie crust she had been rolling. Her voice trembled as she whispered his name, then fell into a silence that told me more than words could. I reached for her, but she pushed the receiver toward me, her eyes wide with a grief too sudden to shape. On the other end, a doctor spoke of heart failure, quick and merciless, the kind that gave no chance for goodbyes. Funerals in our town were always draped in formality. The church pews creaked under the weight of neighbors, the air carried the faint scent of lilies, and the pastor's voice rose and fell like waves upon stone. My brother Charles sat stiff beside me, his jaw clenched, trying to hold himself together in a suit too tight at the shoulders. My mother, veiled in black, folded her hands around a rosary she had not touched in years, each bead trembling as if carrying the weight of her sorrow. I sat still, my heart numb, my mind refusing to accept that the man who had filled our home with his presence was now nothing more than a framed photograph at the front of the church. Afterward, the town gave us casseroles, pies, and condolences, the kitchen counters filled with dishes from neighbors who didn't know what else to give. People stopped by with folded hands and solemn eyes, their words always the same: "He was such a good man." The world seemed to believe that repeating it often enough would build a bridge across our grief. But grief is not bridged so easily. It is a river you must learn to wade, step by step, with water rising higher than you think you can endure. With my father gone, the quiet weight of responsibility fell on me. At 25, I became the one expected to steady the house, to soothe my mother's fragile state, to guide my brother who hid his sorrow behind long walks by the shore. Bills arrived, insurance forms piled up, and the reality of survival pressed against our grief. I felt unprepared, like a child playing at adulthood, yet I had no choice but to learn quickly. It was during those long evenings, after my mother had gone to bed, that I found myself at the oak desk in my father's study. The desk smelled faintly of tobacco and leather polish, its drawers heavy with papers that seemed to breathe secrets. I told myself I was only looking for documents, the will, the deeds, the accounts. But what I found was something else entirely. The first drawer held neat folders, tax returns, utility bills, receipts clipped in careful order. But deeper in, beneath stacks that had yellowed at the edges, were envelopes with handwriting that stopped me cold, letters tied with thin ribbon, their paper brittle, their ink faded. Some addressed to my father, others to my mother, some unsigned altogether. I sat under the dim lamplight, hands trembling, and began to read. The words were not scandalous at first. Discussions of family matters, references to disagreements politely phrased. But as I read more, I began to sense a tension woven into them, a struggle never spoken aloud in our kitchen. There were mentions of choices that must remain hidden, of keeping appearances for the sake of the family name. There was a tone that did not belong to the ordinary worries of bills or school grades. It was heavier, guarded, as though each sentence carried a secret it dared not say aloud. The deeper I read, the more the image of our so-called perfect family began to fracture. The memories of Sunday dinners returned to me, the silence that had once been a puzzle now echoing with the weight of these written words. It was as if the letters were whispering into that silence, filling it with the truths we had all been too afraid to voice. My hands grew damp as I shuffled through them, each page cutting into the illusion I had clung to since childhood. Sometimes I stopped to breathe, to look around the room as though the very walls might judge me for trespassing. The bookshelves, lined with histories and sermons, stood silent. The family photographs on the wall, my parents smiling stiffly, my brother and I as children holding hands, looked down with a kind of frozen patience, as though waiting for me to understand. I wanted to tell myself it was nothing, that families often carried burdens unspoken, but the letters would not allow that comfort. Each phrase was a fissure in the facade, each dated page a reminder that what I had thought was stability was, in truth, a fragile balancing act. Night stretched long as I sat with those papers. The lamp hummed, the clock ticked, the house groaned with the shifting of beams, and still I read. The words refused to loosen their grip on me, pulling me deeper into a history I had never been told. And then came the moment that froze me. While sorting through a stack of deeds and baptism certificates, I came upon our family Bible, a heavy, leather-bound volume that had rested for years on the bookshelf in the parlor. Its spine was cracked, its pages worn soft by generations of fingers tracing verses. I opened it, searching perhaps for records of births and marriages, but what I found was something entirely different. Tucked carefully between the pages of Psalms was an envelope, its paper yellowed, edges frayed, sealed though the glue had begun to loosen with time. The handwriting on the front was my mother's, unmistakably hers, delicate and slanted, the kind she used when addressing wedding invitations or thank you notes. My breath caught as I held it, the weight of the letter heavier than it should have been. I stared at it, my fingers trembling, torn between the impulse to tear it open and the fear of what truth it might unleash. The Bible itself seemed to guard it, as though sacred words could shield secrets from ever being spoken. I did not open it. Not yet. I simply sat there, the envelope trembling in my hands, feeling as though the ground beneath me had shifted. The silence of the house pressed closer, the air thick with questions I was not ready to face, and so I placed the Bible back on the desk, the envelope still hidden within its pages, my heart pounding with the knowledge that nothing in our family would ever look the same once it was read. The rain came early that morning, steady and deliberate, as though the sky itself had chosen to linger in sorrow. It was not the kind of storm that raged with thunder or lashed with wind, but a persistent weeping from the heavens. By noon, every street in our small New England town glistened, the cobblestones slick with water, the gutters running like restless streams. From inside our house I could hear the faint, rhythmic patter against the shingles, and with every drop the world outside seemed farther away. I remember sitting in the parlor, the curtains drawn just enough to blur the gray light that filtered in. The room smelled faintly of damp wood and the lavender polish my mother used on the furniture each Saturday. The old sofa sagged gently beneath its faded upholstery, its cushions softened by decades of use. It was there, on that sofa, that my mother, Helen, chose to sit beside me. She lowered herself slowly, as though the weight she carried made even the act of sitting down a task of great effort. Her hands twisted in her lap. The knuckles were thin, the skin delicate as paper, marked by years of washing, sewing, cooking, tasks that had filled her days, but never quite eased the burdens in her heart. Her dress that afternoon was plain navy, the kind she wore when she wanted to appear tidy but not draw attention. A small row of buttons climbed neatly to her collar, and at the very top, one had come loose, dangling by a thread. Her blonde hair, usually pinned tight in a bun, had surrendered to the damp air, and wisps framed her face, softening the sternness I sometimes saw in her eyes. But it was not her appearance that unsettled me. It was her silence. She sat with her shoulders tense, staring at the rain sliding down the window pane. For a long while, neither of us spoke. I could hear only the steady beat of the storm outside, the low groan of the house adjusting to the damp, and the faint ticking of the clock on the mantel. My heart pounded as if it already knew the weight of the words she was preparing to release. At last, her voice broke the quiet. "Margaret," she said, and even in that single word, I heard something fragile. Her voice trembled, as though the syllables themselves carried too much weight. She kept her gaze fixed on the rain, unable or unwilling to meet mine. "There are things you have never been told, things that shaped us, shaped this family. I have carried them alone for so long." The words settled between us like smoke, impossible to ignore. My hands curled into fists against my knees. I wanted to say something, to ask what she meant, but her face, pale, lips pressed tightly together, made me swallow my questions. She spoke of the past, of a time when the world outside was as rigid as the church steeple that rose above our town. The 1960s, she reminded me, were not as free as people like to remember. Respectability was currency, and reputation was everything. Families who lost, theirs never recovered. In a town like ours, neighbors did not forgive easily. One rumor, one slip, and you were marked, whispered about at the diner, eyed suspiciously at the Sunday service. Her hands trembled as she clasped them tighter. "Your father and I." We had no choice. We were young. The world was watching us, and the rules were unforgiving. Appearances had to be kept. We sacrificed what was truest, Margaret. We sacrificed the truth itself. I felt the words strike deep, sharp as glass. Memories rushed back, those endless Sunday dinners, the heavy silences that stretched across the table. Now I understood. They had not been empty pauses. They had been walls, built high and strong, to hold something back. Tears welled in my eyes before I could stop them, my chest tight with grief for the years of unspoken pain. She continued, her voice breaking in places, but pressing on with the determination of someone who knew this was her only chance. She described the pressure of neighbors' eyes, the expectations of the church, the judgment of a society that demanded perfection at any cost. She and my father had lived with that scrutiny, shaping their choices not by what was right, but by what was necessary to protect the family name. Her words came haltingly, yet each one carried the weight of decades. We thought silence would shield us. We thought if we hid the truth, we could go on, untouched by shame. But Margaret, she turned toward me now, her eyes red with tears. We paid a price. We lost something greater than reputation. We lost our freedom. We lost the truth. At that moment, I broke. The tears I had been holding back spilled down my face, hot and unstoppable. My body shook as sobs escaped, and I covered my mouth, ashamed of the sounds tearing out of me. My mother reached for me then, her arm encircling my shoulders, but even as she held me, I could feel her trembling too. Her embrace was not one of comfort. It was one of survival, two souls clinging together as the storm inside us finally raged free. The rain outside softened, the downpour easing into a gentle drizzle, as if the world itself was listening to our confession. The window glass blurred with streaks, the garden beyond reduced to vague outlines of dripping shrubs and sagging rose bushes. The sound of the storm became a lullaby of sorrow, steady and relentless, echoing the years of silence my mother had endured. We sat like that for a long time, bound together by grief and revelation. I could feel the rise and fall of her breath against my shoulder, uneven and shallow. She whispered again, almost to herself, "We paid with the truth. That was the cost of respectability." Her words cut through me. I thought of the innocence lost, the secrets woven into the fabric of our home, the way silence had been passed down like an heirloom from one generation to the next. I wanted to scream, to demand why, but I couldn't. The weight of her sorrow pressed down on me too heavily. Minutes passed, perhaps an hour. Time became as blurred as the rain on the glass. Finally, my mother shifted, pulling back slightly. Her face was pale, her lips trembling, and for the first time that day, she looked directly into my eyes. And in that gaze, there was something more, something withheld, something even heavier than what she had already confessed. Her hand tightened around mine, her fingers cold and urgent. "Margaret," she whispered, her voice low, almost breaking. "There is more. Something deeper. Something I have never spoken. Not to anyone." Her eyes glistened with fear and sorrow, and in that suspended moment, I knew the storm had not yet passed. The silence in our home became a decision, not an accident. It was chosen carefully, guarded fiercely, as though words themselves might be the spark that could set the whole house aflame. My mother had made it clear. Our survival depended upon discretion, our respectability upon restraint. The truth, whatever form it might have taken, was folded away, hidden beneath layers of everyday routine. From the outside, the Collins family still looked whole. Neighbors saw us on Sundays at the white-steepled church, our clothes pressed, our smiles practiced, our hands folded neatly in our laps. At the market, my mother greeted acquaintances with polite warmth, and my brother Charles kept his chin high as though the world were too far away to touch him. People nodded approvingly, whispering, "What strength, what dignity, after all they've endured." But dignity was only the mask we wore. Inside, the air was heavy. Every glance across the table carried a question unspoken. My mother's eyes would linger on me, soft yet burdened, then turn away before I could respond. Charles retreated into silence of his own, his voice growing rarer with each passing week. The house itself seemed to echo with what was not said, the creak of the floorboards beneath our steps, the sigh of doors closing, the restless hum of the old refrigerator in the kitchen. Silence protected us outwardly. It kept the neighbors from suspecting, it shielded us from gossip, and it let us glide across the surface of town life unbroken. Yet inwardly, that same silence was corrosive. It pressed against the walls of my chest until I lay awake at night, staring at the ceiling, my heart pounding with questions that had no voice. I remember lying in my narrow bed, the quilt pulled up to my chin, listening to the rain or the wind or the faint whistle of a train in the distance. My thoughts refused to rest. Each night was a rehearsal of all the things I longed to ask, all the confessions I wished I had the courage to make. But the rules of our home were carved deep. Silence kept us safe. There were moments when I caught my reflection in the hallway mirror, my own face pale, eyes ringed with sleeplessness, and wondered if the quiet was consuming me from the inside. Even the ordinary rhythms of the household became haunted. At breakfast, the clink of the spoon against the coffee cup seemed too loud, too intrusive. At supper, the scraping of a chair across the floor sounded almost violent against the hush. The smallest noises reminded us of what was missing: conversation, laughter, ease. Charles spent more time by the harbor, his long walk stretching into hours. Sometimes he returned with the smell of salt air clinging to his coat, his eyes distant, as though he had wandered farther than the shoreline. When I asked him where he had been, he only shrugged, offering a half-smile that convinced no one. My mother, busying herself with the dishes, pretended not to notice, though her shoulders stiffened each time. The weight of what we did not say bound us tighter than any words could have. I began to realize that silence, though it could guard us from the judgment of others, was slowly unraveling us within. It was a strange kind of prison, one without bars but with walls nonetheless, walls made of withheld truths and unfinished sentences. Each night, when the house had gone quiet, I lay awake in the dark. I thought of my father, of what he might have wanted us to do, of whether he would have chosen silence or urged us to speak. The ticking of the clock grew unbearable, each second hammering home the emptiness of the unsaid. I prayed sometimes, whispering into the dark, though even my prayers felt trapped, bouncing back from the ceiling without reaching anyone at all. The longer it went on, the more it gnawed at me. Dreams blurred into waking thoughts. In them, I heard voices, my mother's, my father's, sometimes my own, speaking words I could not catch. I woke drenched in sweat, the impression of unfinished conversations lingering like shadows at the edge of my vision. By day, I carried on. I smiled at neighbors, folded laundry, prepared meals. But inside, the silence roared. It was during one of those restless nights that I resolved to find answers, even if the questions themselves terrified me. And so, on a crisp autumn afternoon, when the sky stretched pale and the air smelled faintly of wood smoke from neighbors' chimneys, I turned my attention to the attic. The attic was a place of dust and memory. The wooden stairs creaked as I climbed, each step echoing in the stillness of the house. The small window at the far end cast a dim light, enough to reveal shapes draped in sheets, trunks stacked in corners, boxes marked with years long past. The air smelled of cedar and old paper, with a hint of mothballs clinging stubbornly to forgotten coats. I moved carefully, lifting lids, peering into boxes filled with photographs, holiday decorations, children's school projects yellowed by time. It felt as though every object whispered a piece of the past, fragments of a life we had tried so hard to present as flawless. And then, against the far wall beneath a sheet of dust, I found it. A wooden chest, small but sturdy, its surface scarred by years of use. The brass hinges were tarnished, the lock stiff with rust. My breath caught as I brushed my hand across the lid, the dust rising like a ghost disturbed. It was my mother's. I knew it instantly, though I had never seen it before. Something about the delicate carvings along the edge, the faint smell of lavender that clung to its surface, told me it had belonged to her. I knelt beside it, my knees pressing into the wooden floorboards, my hands trembling as they rested on the lid. The chest seemed to hum with secrets, waiting, patient, for the moment someone would dare to open it. The hinges groaned as I lifted the lid, the scent of cedar and old paper rising like a ghost from the past. Inside, layers of fabric, faded shawls, yellowed lace handkerchiefs, a child's woolen sweater long outgrown, rested quietly as though guarding what lay beneath. My hands trembled as I moved them aside, each fold of cloth disclosing more than cloth alone. It revealed the life my mother had once lived, a life she had never spoken of. At the bottom of the chest, pressed flat against the wood, I found it. A single envelope, its paper fragile with age, the ink on the front nearly faded away. The handwriting, however, I knew instantly. It was my mother's. The delicate slope of the letters, the way her H curled with elegance, the soft pressure of her pen strokes. This was her voice, captured long before I was born. My breath caught as I held it, the weight of the paper far heavier than it should have been. I sat cross-legged on the attic floor, the dust tickling my throat, the dim afternoon light slanting in through the narrow window. With a care that felt almost reverent, I slid the letter free from its sleeve. The paper crackled, brittle but intact, as though it had been waiting decades for this moment. Her words began simply, "To my future self, and perhaps to the child who may one day need to know." I could see her, young and unsure, writing by the glow of a lamp, the scratch of her pen loud in a silent room. The words painted her as a woman, cornered by circumstance, hemmed in by a world that offered little mercy. She wrote of a time when whispers threatened to undo everything. There had been an incident, not described in full but heavy with implication, that could have shattered our family's name. Neighbors had grown suspicious. Church elders had asked pointed questions, and the air in town had turned sharp with judgment. My mother had been summoned, pressured by those who held power in that place, to make a choice: expose the truth and let the family be ruined, or agree to an arrangement that would keep the whispers at bay. "I signed the paper," she confessed in her looping script. A quiet agreement, written not in fairness but in necessity. It was the only way to silence the storm that circled us. I did not betray our family, I saved it. But in saving it, I condemned us to silence. The words blurred as my eyes filled with tears. I blinked them away and read on. She described the men she met in a back office at the town clerk's building, stern-faced, middle-aged, their suits smelling faintly of mothballs and tobacco. Their voices were firm, their instructions precise. My mother had been given no room to argue. She was told what must be done, what must never be spoken of again, and what would happen should the truth ever slip free. "I was only 24, she wrote, too young to carry such a burden, yet old enough to know it was the only path left. I prayed for strength, though my prayers felt like pebbles dropped into a well without bottom. I walked out of that room no longer the same woman I had been. I had signed away not only the truth, but part of myself." I pressed the letter to my chest, my hands trembling. I could almost see her then, my mother, not as the quiet, middle-aged woman who raised me, but as a young wife, her blonde hair pinned neatly, her eyes wide with fear, signing her name with ink that must have felt like blood. As I read, a strange mixture of shock and tenderness rose within me. I wanted to cry out in anger that she had been forced into this, that society had cornered her, that neighbors and elders and faceless officials had demanded such a cruel sacrifice. But more than that, I felt sorrow for her, for the weight she had borne alone all these years. She wrote of the sleepless nights that followed, of lying awake beside my father, unable to tell him everything, afraid he might break under the knowledge. She confessed to watching us, my brother and me, as children at play, wondering if we would ever learn the truth, and fearing what it might do to us if we did. "I carried it in silence," the letter said, "because silence was the only shield I had left. Do not think of me as weak. Think of me as desperate and in desperation, determined to protect what mattered most." Tears spilled freely down my cheeks. I thought of the woman who had brushed my hair before school, who had baked pies for Sunday supper, who had smiled with quiet grace when neighbors praised her composure. All the while she had been holding this secret, this impossible burden, beneath the surface of her calm. She had not been merely reserved, she had been enduring. By the time I reached the final lines, my chest ached with grief and understanding. If you are reading this, Margaret, then the silence has lasted too long. Know that everything I did for you, for your brother, for the name we carried in this town. I chose survival over truth, though the cost was dear. Forgive me, if you can. And remember that love, however silent, was always at the heart of my choice. The letter ended there. No signature, no flourish, only the faint mark of her pen where it had pressed too hard, leaving a groove in the paper. I sat in the attic, the letter trembling in my hands, my tears falling onto the page. I felt the world tilt as though the ground beneath me had shifted. For the first time, I understood the full scope of my mother's sacrifice. It had not been betrayal, but a desperate act of love. She had shielded us, even if it meant losing a piece of herself. And yet, as the last words lingered in my mind, I knew this secret would not stay buried. It was too powerful, too heavy to remain locked in a chest. It would ripple outward, changing not only how I saw my mother, but how every bond in our family would be measured from this moment forward. The tears would not stop. They blurred the ink, spotted the paper, fell heavy into my lap. I pressed the letter against me, rocking slightly as though I were trying to cradle both myself and the truth I now carried. In that attic beneath the slanted roof and the whisper of wind through the eaves, I realized nothing between us would ever be the same again. The letter did not remain mine alone. Within days, its words spilled into the heart of our family, shaping conversations that had long been postponed, demanding that silence no longer stand in for peace. We gathered first in the living room, the same space where countless evenings had passed in quiet restraint. The curtains were drawn back, letting in the fading light of day, as if even the sun wished to witness what was finally to be spoken. My brother Charles sat with his elbows on his knees, his brow furrowed, his hands clasped tightly together. His wife Anna perched uneasily on the edge of a chair, her eyes flickering between us, uncertain of her place in this reckoning. Across from me sat our younger sister Eleanor, her face pale, lips pressed thin as though holding back a flood of words. For a moment no one spoke. The weight of the letter lingered in the room, heavier than any words we might offer. Then Charles broke the silence. His voice was rough, strained with years of questions unasked. "All this time," he said, "we lived as though we were whole, when really we were carrying something broken." Eleanor's voice rose sharply, trembling at its edges. "Do you know what it felt like, Margaret? To grow up under all those stares, to sense something was wrong but never be told what. I felt like a stranger in my own house." Her words sliced the air. For a heartbeat, anger threatened to take root, to harden into bitterness. Yet as I looked at her, I saw not fury but grief. Grief for the years stolen, the trust fractured, the innocence denied. I leaned forward, my hands open, my tears unhidden. "I know," I whispered, "and I'm sorry. We were all kept from the truth. But maybe now, with this letter, we can finally see each other for who we are, not who we pretended to be." Charles let out a long sigh, his shoulders sinking. "I want to be angry at her," he said, meaning our mother. "But how can I be? She bore the weight for all of us. She made the choice, and it nearly destroyed her. I can't hate her for trying to save us." The words opened something in the room. Anger gave way to sorrow. Sorrow softened into compassion. One by one, we spoke our hurts aloud, how the silence had shaped us, how the distance had carved hollows in our lives. There were raised voices, tears that fell hot and unrestrained, but for the first time in decades, nothing was held back. In that messy unraveling, healing began. By admitting the pain, we lessened its power. By naming the hurt, we loosened its hold. Forgiveness did not arrive all at once, like a sudden dawn. It came slowly, like light seeping into the corners of a darkened room. Weeks passed, and the conversations continued. Around the dining table, in the backyard beneath the maple tree, even while washing dishes together at the sink, every moment became an opportunity to turn silence into speech, estrangement into understanding. There were setbacks, moments, when tempers flared or old wounds reopened, but we learned to circle back, to soften, to try again. I began to see my siblings not as rivals in grief, but as companions in survival. Eleanor's sharp words softened into candor. Charles's sternness melted into protectiveness. We were, all of us, children of the same secret, shaped by it in different ways, yet bound by the same longing for release. And in forgiving, we found one another again. Time moved on. The seasons turned, leaves brightened and fell, snow returned, spring followed. Our family, once fractured, found new rhythms. Holidays became more than obligations. They became reunions marked by laughter that no longer felt forced. We told stories freely, even the painful ones, knowing that honesty itself had become our inheritance. As I grew older, I felt compelled to preserve what we had learned. I began to write, at first in journals, then in longer reflections, until finally I crafted the story of our family as a gift not only to my children and grandchildren, but to the community that had once judged us in silence. At church gatherings, community centers, and later in small printed booklets passed from hand to hand, I shared the truth. Not every detail of our private pain, but the lesson it had carved into me, that silence can shelter for a season, but it also corrodes. That truth, though painful, holds the power to set us free. I would tell them, in my steady voice, the truth may break you, but it will also rebuild you. Forgiveness is not weakness. It is the strongest act a human heart can offer. The young people listened. Some leaned forward, eyes wide as if hearing their own struggles echoed in mine. Some wept quietly, confessing afterward that they too had secrets buried deep in their families. Others thanked me for reminding them that love could survive even the hardest storms. I found joy in these moments, joy in knowing that my mother's sacrifice, though born of fear, had not been in vain. By speaking of it openly, I had transformed her silence into a message of courage for others. Now, in the later years of my life, I live in a kind of peace I once thought unreachable. My days are simple. Mornings spent writing by the window where sunlight spills across the floor. Afternoons knitting scarves and blankets for grandchildren. Evenings with books that carry me into worlds both familiar and strange. The house hums with quiet, but it is no longer the suffocating silence of secrets. It is the calm silence of contentment. When family visits, the rooms fill with laughter, the walls echo with conversation. There are no more forbidden questions, no more eyes turned away in fear. We speak freely, we disagree, we forgive quickly. That, I have come to see, is the true legacy of the Collins family. Not perfection, not reputation, but resilience and grace. As I sit at my desk, pen in hand, I write these words for whoever may need them. Face the truth. Forgive when you can. Begin again, as often as life asks you to. For it is never too late to choose honesty, never too late to choose love. That is the inheritance I leave behind. Not wealth, not property, but a spiritual legacy. A reminder that even in the most shadowed families, even in the heaviest silences, there is always the chance for light. And so, with the years that remain to me, I live gently. I savor a cup of tea at dawn. I delight in the small triumphs of my grandchildren. I take comfort in the rhythm of yarn pulled through fingers, in the turning of pages late into the night. Each day feels like a gift unwrapped slowly, with gratitude. This is my life's final chapter, not defined by secrets, but by truth, not marked by bitterness, but by forgiveness, and not weighed down by silence, but uplifted by love. Sometimes the most powerful stories are not the ones shouted from the rooftops, but the quiet ones, carried in the stillness of ordinary lives. They remind us that silence can weigh as heavily as words, and that forgiveness, when it finally arrives, can feel like sunlight after a long winter. What matters most is not perfection, nor the image we present to the world, but the courage to be honest, the strength to forgive, and the tenderness to begin again. Each of us carries burdens, some seen, some hidden, yet it is in sharing them that we discover we are not alone. I hope this story leaves you with a moment of reflection, a pause to think about the truths in your own life, the ones you've spoken, and perhaps the ones you've kept close to your heart. May you find peace in honesty, comfort in forgiveness, and joy in the small, everyday moments that make life worth living. And if this story touched you, I would be grateful if you liked this video and subscribe to the channel. It helps me continue sharing these journeys of the heart. Wherever you are tonight, may your home be filled with warmth and your heart with peace.